The quiet crisis. Missing children and whispers in the dark. It started as a whisper in the shadows. The kind of thing passed between grieving mothers on Facebook or murmured in school parking lots after another kid vanished without a trace. At first, no one really listened. In North Texas, a region sprawling from the urban core of Dallas-Fort Worth to rural outposts where cell service flickered like bad memories, children were disappearing. Not en masse, not with sirens blaring or Amber Alerts flashing on every screen. It was subtler than that. A missing 14-year-old here, a runaway 15-year-old there. Authorities offered the usual lines. She's probably with friends. Give it a few days. Teenagers do this sometimes, but the numbers told a different story. By late 2024, over 600 children had been reported missing in Texas, and an alarming number of those cases came from Dallas, Tarrant, and Collin counties. In Oak Cliff, a low-income neighborhood southwest of Dallas, parents like Rosalia Torres were already ringing alarm bells. Her daughter, Lupita, vanished walking home from her after-school job at a convenience store. No signs of a struggle. No witnesses. Her phone, dead. Police chalked it up as a likely runaway situation, despite Lupita's spotless record and plans to attend community college in the spring. She wasn't the kind to run, Rosalia told reporters later. She had everything planned. Graduation, prom, her first car. She never even made it home that day. And Lupita wasn't alone. In the months that followed, dozens more families came forward, many of them Black or Latino, with stories hauntingly similar. Their kids, mostly teens, mostly girls, though some boys too, simply vanished. Some left behind clues, scribbled notes, unlocked phones, online messages with usernames no one could trace. But the cases rarely made the news. Law enforcement quietly filed them, community bulletin boards posted a few flyers, and life moved on. Except it wasn't moving on. The red thread that no one was following, the first person to connect the dots, wasn't a cop or a federal agent. It was a social worker, Deja Morris, who worked in the Dallas child welfare system. Deja had seen it all. Foster kids bouncing between homes, runaways cycling back through shelters, and teens who aged out of the system and disappeared within weeks. But something about the recent wave of vanishings chilled her. She began logging cases in her spare time, obsessively scrolling through missing persons databases, social media posts, and online forums. What she found was disturbing. Several of the missing teens had last pinged their phones in similar areas, near motels off I-35, truck stops in Denton County, and abandoned houses in East Fort Worth. Some were last seen with older boyfriends, men in their 20s or 30s, who vanished just as quickly. And then there were the online patterns, encrypted chat apps, fake modeling offers, and seemingly innocuous TikTok DMs. Many of the girls had been communicating with strangers who promised quick cash, photo shoots, even record deals. It was textbook grooming, and it was happening right under everyone's noses. Deja contacted local police. She even emailed the state's Department of Public Safety, but few took her seriously. These are high-risk kids, she was told. They move fast. Some don't want to be found. What no one said, but everyone silently understood, was this. If these missing children had been white, middle class, and from the suburbs, the response might have been different. From runaways to recruits. Meanwhile, in Garland, Texas, a suburb northeast of Dallas, school counselor Jamie Whitaker was fighting her own quiet battle. 3 students had gone missing from her high school in the span of 4 months. All were girls of color. 2 had been in foster care. 1 had come to her weeks earlier with a story that made her blood run cold. She said she was being watched, Jamie recalled. She said this guy would wait outside her school every day, not say anything, just stare. She stopped coming to class after that. Police were called. Nothing came of it. It was around this time that a local detective, Jason Rudd, stumbled upon a string of files in an unrelated gang investigation. They included photos from a burner phone confiscated during a drug bust, and several of those photos were of girls currently listed as missing. But these weren't selfies or casual snapshots. They were posed, disturbing, provocative. The kind of images traffickers post to private channels on the dark web. Behind some of the girls, you could see motel interiors, iron-barred windows, and in one case, what looked like a brand or tattoo on a young girl's shoulder. S3 Rudd dug deeper. He cross-referenced dates, locations, and facial recognition matches. More of the missing teens showed up in unmarked files, in backgrounds of surveillance photos, or in ring camera footage from addresses flagged for drug activity. What emerged wasn't just a string of abductions, it was a pipeline. The grooming Machine 1 survivor eventually came forward. Her name was withheld, but she was 16, found during a drug sweep in Arlington. She had been missing for nearly 8 months and was heavily traumatized. During a series of interviews, she described how she was lured online by a man posing as a modeling scout. Within 2 weeks, she had been driven to an audition in a motel and was never allowed to leave. They told me my family didn't want me anymore, she said, that I belonged to them now. If I tried to run, they'd kill my brother. The girl was one of the lucky few recovered, but her testimony and the names she provided pointed to a larger, more coordinated system. Girls were being recruited. At schools, shelters, group homes, even churches, they were drugged, beaten, branded, and moved from city to city to avoid detection. It was a domestic trafficking ring hiding in plain sight. Warning signs ignored parents like Rosalia Torres continued to speak out, gathering for vigils, posting flyers, organizing Facebook groups like Find Our Missing Kids TX. They wrote letters to lawmakers, showed up at town halls, and begged for answers. Sometimes they were met with sympathy, more often, silence. There's a reason this was allowed to go on so long, said community organizer Marcia Etienne, who had tracked over 70 missing cases tied to Dallas area Black and Hispanic youth. These kids weren't seen as victims, they were seen as disposable, and that's the quiet crisis. No one looked, because no one cared, but someone was watching. The package won early morning in January 2025, Detective Jason Rudd walked into his precinct office and found a small, unmarked manila envelope on his desk. No postage, no return address. Inside were several items: a Polaroid photo of a girl tied to a bed in what looked like an RV, a map with red markings along I-45 and I-20, a thumb drive with folders labeled Inventory, Routes, and S3, and a note typed on plain printer paper. You're not even close. The shield isn't real. But the storm is coming. Rudd stared at the note for several minutes before calling it in. That same week, Homeland Security received an anonymous tip about a network operating under the name Soteria, the name of the Greek goddess of deliverance, twisted now into something dark and cruel. It was the first breadcrumb. The operation that would soon uncover 109 trafficked children, result in 244 arrests, and shake the nation to its core, had just begun. Building the case: surveillance, stings, and silent allies. The manila envelope delivered to Detective Jason Rudd wasn't just a clue, it was a warning. Inside the Dallas Police Department, he spread the contents across a war room table beneath flickering fluorescent lights. A grim collection: Polaroids of abused children, maps marked with cryptic red circles, and a flash drive filled with files that, to any outsider, looked like shipping manifests. Dates, names, weights, and coded phrases like delivery confirmed. An outbound S317, but Rudd wasn't an outsider anymore. Not after months of watching kids disappear with eerie precision. He stared at the word burned into one girl's shoulder in a photograph, S3. The same brand found on several teens recovered from nearby busts. The same label whispered by terrified survivors. They said, "I belong to S3 now." He wasn't sure what S3 meant yet, but one thing was clear. This wasn't a collection of random abductions. This was industrial, methodical, and terrifying logistics in its efficiency. The silent formation of Task Force Soteria 2 weeks later, a closed-door meeting took place at a nondescript federal building in Arlington, Texas. In attendance, representatives from the FBI, Homeland Security Investigations, HSI, U.S. Marshals Service, the Texas Department of Public Safety, and several North Texas police departments. A new joint task force was formed, quietly, with no press release or political fanfare. They named it Soteria Shield, a nod to the Greek goddess of deliverance. It was both a battle cry and a challenge. Protect the vulnerable, strike the ones who prey on them. But the mission was steeped in paranoia from the start. They had reason to believe local law enforcement had been compromised. Several names mentioned by survivors were officers, judges, even a former city councilman. Information was leaking fast, and every move risked tipping off the ring, so they kept the circle tight. Phones were scrubbed, devices checked for. Spyware. Teams worked from unmarked vans and temporary locations. Even their digital systems were kept offline. It wasn't just a sting, it was war. Tracking the shadows. They started with surveillance. The task force flagged every location marked on the envelope's map. Motels, storage units, gas stations, RV parks and massage businesses with no business licenses. Agents set up in parked cars working 12-hour shifts. They filmed license plates, tracked patterns. Same white cargo van circling a Waco motel every Wednesday. Same tattooed man with a limp visiting 4 different motels in 4 cities. Same adolescent girls, always a different one each week. Some were seen escorted by older men. Others were working in parking lots, offering escorts to truckers who never questioned the age of the girls or didn't care. The operation uncovered a chilling pattern. S3 wasn't just a group, it was a network. Each node was a different operation, some as small as one man and a girl, others involving multiple traffickers, recruiters, drivers, and enforcers. They used burner phones, coded language, cryptocurrency, and even ride-share apps to move children between cities, avoiding major interstates in favor of rural roads. It was like chasing smoke, but the agents were finally starting to catch glimpses of the fire. The undercover operatives. That's when Special Agent Rebecca Langford went undercover. Langford, a seasoned HSI operative, fluent in multiple languages and trained in dark web infiltration, posed as a recruiter for a rival trafficking ring. She created a persona complete with a backstory, social media presence, and encrypted communications with high-level traffickers. Within weeks, she was invited to an online forum called The Exchange, a marketplace for trading girls and boys, protected by multiple layers of encryption. There she saw it firsthand. Profiles of children, listed by age, race, and experience level. Some even had timers, countdowns to when the child would be moved or retired. The forum used code words like puppets, playthings, and merch. Most disturbing were the live stream requests where clients, often overseas, paid top dollar to view or instruct real-time abuse. Langford's mission was clear: infiltrate the forum, gain trust, and extract as much information as possible. What she found confirmed their worst fears. The ring was being supplied by at least 4 different cities in Texas alone, with hubs in Dallas, Houston, Tyler, and San Antonio. And many of the children were being held temporarily in stash houses before being moved to other states: Louisiana, Arkansas, even as far as Nevada. Worse, some kids were being trafficked across borders, taken to Mexico via cartel-affiliated groups who traded in both drugs and bodies. The survivor who turned the tide. At the same time, in a trauma recovery center in Denton County, a girl named Alyssa, name changed for protection, began talking. She had been found during a traffic stop in an SUV with 3 other children, all of them under 14, all of them silent, empty-eyed. Alyssa was 15. She had been missing for over a year and had been sold across state lines 6 times, but she remembered names, drop-off locations, tattoo patterns. Her branding, S341. At first, Alyssa barely spoke. She flinched when doors opened. She refused to sleep in the dark, but after weeks of intensive therapy and safety assurances, she began revealing how the ring operated. She named recruiters, women who posed as mentors at juvenile shelters. She described stash houses, one in particular on the outskirts of Plano, where the windows were blacked out and cages were kept in the garage. She even described a selection room in an abandoned church where children were displayed to buyers. Alyssa's testimony wasn't just powerful, it was actionable. Her memories matched Rebecca Langford's undercover findings, Jason Rudd's surveillance logs, and Deja Morris's initial case mapping. Everything was aligning: names, faces, places, Operation Soteria Shield was almost ready to strike. The raid that nearly went wrong. Before the full takedown, the task force ran one test raid, a controlled operation on a suspected stash house in rural Kaufman County. They expected a small bust, maybe 2 traffickers, hopefully 1 or 2 rescued children. Instead, what they found shocked them. 6 children, the youngest only 8 years old, were discovered drugged, restrained, and held in kennel-like cages. 3 armed men were arrested, including 1 former police officer. Surveillance equipment was everywhere. One room was filled with hard drives, ledgers, and even a whiteboard with dates, prices, and names. It was a trafficking hub disguised as a farmhouse, but it nearly went sideways. A neighbor spotted the unmarked vans and tipped off someone, a suspected client who was seen burning papers in a nearby shed. Luckily, the hard drives were recovered before they could be destroyed. What was on them would later be described as the most disturbing evidence in Texas trafficking history. But it also included the full S3 network hierarchy, drop points, coded identifiers, buyer lists, even law enforcement call logs. The clock was ticking. The leak proved what they'd feared all along. Someone inside law enforcement was dirty. The task force knew they had only one chance. If word got out, the traffickers would scatter, children would be moved or killed, and evidence destroyed. Every raid would have to happen at once, a massive, coordinated strike spanning more than 24 locations across North Texas. They had 10 days to plan. Names were double-checked. Teams were armed. Warrants were quietly signed. On May 14, 2025, at 4 a.m., over 140 agents, dozens of local officers, and federal operatives launched what would become the largest anti-trafficking bust in Texas history, but no one was ready for what they were about to find. The raids, 48 hours, that changed everything. May 14th, 2025, 4:80 a.m. The wind was still. In North Texas, as the first wave of unmarked tactical vans fanned out across Dallas, Fort Worth, Arlington, and as far as Tyler and Waco. In one of the vans sat Agent Rebecca Langford, dressed in full tactical gear. Her jaw was clenched, her eyes locked on the GPS screen. Across more than 30 locations, from grimy motels to quiet cul-de-sacs, agents were moving in, synchronized down to the second. It was a raid operation, the scale of which hadn't been seen since post-9/11 terror sweeps. They called it the Storm, and it was about to crash down on the heart of one of the most insidious child trafficking networks in America. 3 a.m. The first entry, the first site hit, was a small, nondescript 2-bedroom house in Arlington with a chain-link fence and a blue tarp over the back patio. On paper, it was a rental property. In reality, it was a child distribution hub where minors were briefly held before being shipped out to buyers or transported across state lines. Agents stormed the door. Inside, the air reeked of mildew, sweat, and bleach. They found 5 children, aged 9 to 15, all of them curled in sleeping bags on a hardwood floor, terrified and silent. In the kitchen, agents discovered paperwork, logs with initials, weights, delivery times. 2 men were arrested. One had a badge, not a fake, a real one, issued from a nearby sheriff's department. It was just the beginning. 21 a.m. Denton County Motel 6 just north of the city. Another team breached 2 rooms in a Motel 6 flagged by surveillance weeks earlier. One was empty, the other was locked from the inside. They busted through the door. Inside were 3 men, one filming, the others in various stages of undress. And on the bed, a 13-year-old girl chained to the frame, her mouth gagged. The room was rigged with cameras, live streaming to a dock. Web portal Langford had identified in her undercover work. The stream had been active for 17 minutes when the team cut the feed. One of the arrested men was a county judge from Louisiana. Another was a known buyer with 2 prior arrests that had been quietly dismissed. The girl was rushed to a hospital. She was later identified as one of the missing children from Garland ISD, reported missing over 10 months earlier. 2 a.m. The church in East Fort Worth. A SWAT team surrounded a former Pentecostal church. Abandoned since 2019. Neighbors thought it was empty. The agents knew better. Inside, the sanctuary had been turned into what one officer called a slave market. Partitioned by heavy curtains, the space was divided into 5 stalls. Each one had a twin mattress, chains, and small shelves with snacks and bottled water. On a table near the pulpit, a laptop playing a slideshow of photos, all minors. Underneath, a folder labeled Scheduled Appointments, week of May 12th. 4 girls and 2 boys were recovered. The youngest, only 7. All bore markings, tattoos, brands, initials. All were drugged. A hidden basement revealed a chilling discovery: a row of coffins, 4 of them occupied, by children too far gone to be rescued. Starved, tortured, forgotten. The agents wept. Then they got angry. 3:33 a.m. at the Stash Farm. A quiet 10-acre property near Tyler, Texas, was believed to be a marijuana grow site. Drones had picked up thermal movement in the barn. A strike team moved in. What they found inside was worse than any drug farm. The barn had been converted into a holding facility. Rows of horse stalls retrofitted with steel bars and padlocks. 18 children were discovered, malnourished, bruised, and disoriented. Some spoke no English. 1 girl screamed every time a man entered the room. They had been kept like livestock. 3 men were arrested, 2 with cartel ties, 1 a former ICE contractor. Satellite phones and route maps to Nuevo Laredo were found in their truck, confirming cross-border movement of children. Nearby, they found a fire pit still smoldering. Agents would later uncover burned documents and SIM cards, likely evidence set aflame just minutes before the raid. 4:45 a.m., the warehouse back in Dallas, a team descended on what appeared to be an abandoned distribution warehouse on the Ida south side. The location had long been flagged by Langford and matched coordinates from the original map found on Detective Rudd's desk. This would become the largest single recovery site of the operation. In the cavernous, windowless interior, 26 children were found, nearly all of them gagged, blindfolded, and handcuffed. Plastic bins labeled with initials and numbers sat on shelves. Some contained clothing, IDs, or stuffed animals. A locked cabinet held a cache of passports, most fake, and birth certificates. Whiteboard listed upcoming transfers coded by number. One column was titled, Exchanges, Dubai, LHR, Vegas. Langford's hands trembled as she opened a steel door in the back and found a makeshift photo studio, complete with lighting rigs, costumes, and a branded backdrop. The logo? S3, The Fallout, Nation in Shock by. The end of 48 hours, the operation had uncovered out of 9 children rescued, 44 individuals arrested, 36 sites across 17 Texas counties, raided, multiple arrests of public officials, law enforcement, and healthcare workers, seizure of over $3.2 million in cash, weapons, encrypted computers, and forged documents. The children were placed in protective custody under heavily restricted access. A separate federal facility was activated. As a trauma recovery center staffed with specialists, therapists, and undercover guards, survivors were given new identities, intensive therapy, and federal witness protections. But the scars, they would remain forever. Media blackout. At first, though, federal officials anticipated massive media coverage. Operation Soteria Shield was initially kept quiet. The scope was too massive, the evidence too disturbing, names too politically sensitive. Only a week later did the Department of Homeland Security release a brief statement. A joint federal operation in North Texas has resulted in the rescue of over 100 exploited minors and the arrest of more than 240 individuals involved in a domestic trafficking network. That was all, but leaks began to spread. Independent journalists, whistleblowers, and even a few local outlets began piecing it together. And soon the country would realize this wasn't an isolated ring. It was a symptom of something much darker and far more widespread. Phoebus Metwari. Politicians, profiteers, and dark web marketplaces. The revelation of the trafficking ring's reach sent shockwaves far beyond the initial arrests. What had begun as a localized investigation into missing foster children had spiraled into something far more sinister. A sprawling network that ensnared powerful figures across multiple states. The names surfacing in encrypted communications, and financial trails were not just those of low-level criminals, but of people who moved in the highest circles of influence. Local politicians, respected church leaders, and even tech entrepreneurs who had built fortunes on innovation while secretly funding this underground trade. The dark web auction blocks detective Sarah Mercer and her team had anticipated that the traffickers would be using the dark web to coordinate, but the scale of the operation still left them reeling. Forensic tech analyst Javier Ruiz, hunched over his monitors in the cybercrime unit, had spent weeks infiltrating hidden marketplaces where children were listed like commodities. "It's like eBay for human beings," Ruiz muttered, his voice tight with disgust. The listings were clinical, devoid of emotion. Healthy female, 8 wires, no medical issues, immediate delivery available, crypto only. Some even included photos, blurred but recognizable, of terrified children in dimly lit rooms. The traffickers had refined their system. Buyers placed bids using untraceable cryptocurrencies, primarily Monero and Bitcoin, routed through mixing services. Once a sale was confirmed, the children were moved through a relay of safe houses, their transport disguised as legitimate business, church retreats, corporate events, even interstate medical transports. Ruiz's breakthrough came when he noticed a recurring IP address masked behind layers of encryption. It wasn't foolproof, nothing ever was, but it was enough to lead them to a server farm in Nevada, registered under a shell company owned by a tech mogul named Daniel Voss. Voss had made his fortune in cybersecurity. The irony wasn't lost on Mercer. The politicians' play, while Ruiz dug into the digital trail, Mercer and Agent Cole Turner turned their attention to the list of names tied to the network's financial backers. Among them was Councilman Richard Hale, a rising star in state politics, who had built his platform on family values and child welfare reform. Hale's bank records showed suspiciously large deposits coinciding with dates of missing children reports. When confronted, he feigned ignorance, claiming his accounts had been hacked. But then Mercer found the burner phone, tucked in a hidden compartment of Hale's luxury car, loaded with encrypted messages arranging deliveries to undisclosed locations. Even more disturbing was the involvement of Reverend Elias Carter, a beloved community leader whose sermons drew thousands. Carter's charity, Hands of Hope, had been a front for funneling children into the network under the guise of missionary placements. His arrest sent the media into a frenzy, with some outlets spinning it as a misunderstanding, a smear campaign against a man of God, but the evidence was undeniable. The leak. Then came the first major setback, a week before Hale and Carter were set to be indicted. An anonymous tip reached Mercer. "They know you're coming. Someone inside is talking." The warning proved true when a SWAT raid on a suspected auction house turned up empty. The traffickers had cleared out hours before. Someone had tipped them off. The task force was compromised. Internal Affairs launched an investigation, but the damage was done. Trust within the team eroded. Mercer found herself eyeing even her closest colleagues with suspicion. Was it the quiet analyst who always lingered near the evidence locker, the veteran officer who had access to sealed warrants, or someone higher up? The whistleblower vanishes. Amid the chaos, a potential break emerged in the form of Dr. Lillian Graves, a former pediatrician who had worked with Hands of Hope before realizing what was really happening. Graves had collected records, dates, names, even voice recordings of Carter discussing inventory with an unknown buyer. She had agreed to testify. Then, 2 days before her deposition, Graves didn't show up for a scheduled check-in. Her apartment was found unlocked, her laptop still open, a half-written email to Mercer unsent. The only sign of struggle was a shattered teacup on the kitchen floor. The message was clear: talk and you disappear. The judge's recusal, the final blow, came when Judge Harold Winslow, presiding over the first major trial in the case, abruptly recused himself. His official statement cited personal reasons, but sources close to the courthouse whispered that Winslow had received a threat. A photo of his teenage daughter walking home from school, time-stamped that morning. The implication was unmistakable. The network had eyes everywhere. The cryptocurrency trail with the walls closing in, Ruiz made a desperate push to follow the money. The traffickers had grown sloppy in their panic, rushing transactions through less secure channels. One payment, sent in haste, led Ruiz to a wallet linked to a shell corporation in the Caymans, and from there, to a man named Vincent Crow, a reclusive billionaire with ties to private military contractors. Crow's name hadn't appeared in any of their initial files. He was a ghost in the system, But the deeper Ruiz dug, the more connections emerged. Crow wasn't just a buyer, he was a sponsor, and he was preparing to vanish. As Mercer reviewed Ruiz's findings, her phone buzzed with an unknown number. The voice on the other end was distorted, mechanical. "You're digging in the wrong. Grave detective." The line went dead. Outside her window, a black sedan idled at the curb, just long enough for her to notice, before speeding away. Someone was watching, and the network wasn't done fighting back. Aftermath. Survivors speak. Communities reel, the arrests had made headlines, but the real story was only beginning to unfold in the hushed voices of the survivors. Detective Sarah Mercer stood outside the safe house where the rescued children were being kept, her breath fogging in the cold morning air. The building was unmarked, its location known only to a handful of trusted caseworkers and law enforcement. Even now, after everything, they couldn't be too careful. Inside, the walls were painted soft blues and greens, a feeble attempt to make the space feel less like an institution. Toys and books lined the shelves donated by well-meaning strangers. But the children, hollow-eyed, flinching at sudden movements, didn't touch them. The first testimony, 14-year-old Noah, was the first to speak. He sat across from Mercer in a small, soundproofed room, his fingers picking at the frayed edges of his sweatshirt sleeves. A child psychologist, Dr. Elena Vasquez, sat beside him, her presence a silent reassurance. Noah's voice was barely above a whisper. "They moved us in trucks, like we were cargo." He spoke in fragments, his sentences breaking apart whenever. The memories became too much. The traffickers had kept them in basements, shipping containers, even the back rooms of seemingly legitimate businesses, a church daycare, a private boarding school. They made us work, cleaning, packing stuff. Sometimes other things. His throat worked, his gaze dropping to the table. "If you cried, they punished everyone. So we learned not to cry." Mercer's pen stilled. She had read the files, seen the photos, but hearing it from him, from a child, made her stomach twist. The others, one by one, others began to share. 15-year-old Marisol, her arms wrapped around herself as if she could disappear into her own embrace, described being auctioned on the dark web. "They called us lots, like we were things." 12-year-old Jaden, his voice shaking, told them about the buyers, men and women who came in the night, their faces hidden behind masks, their hands cold and impersonal. They took pictures, said it was for clients. And then there was Lila. At 10 years old, she was the smallest of the group, her dark hair tangled, her knees drawn up to her chest. She didn't speak at first, not until Dr. Vasquez gently placed a stuffed bear in her. "Lap, they said if we talked, they'd find our families," Lila whispered. "They said they always find you," the psychological toll doctor. Vasquez had worked with trafficking survivors before, but even she was shaken. "This level of systematic terror, it rewires their brains," she told Mercer later, her voice low. "They've been conditioned to believe their captors are omnipotent, that there's no real escape." Nightmares were common. So were panic attacks, dissociative episodes, and most heartbreaking guilt. Some of them blame themselves, Vasquez admitted. They think if they'd been quieter, smarter, faster, maybe the others wouldn't have been hurt, Mercer thought. Of the ones still missing, the ones who hadn't been found, how many more are out there believing the same thing? The community's React news of the survivors' testimonies leaked. No one knew how, and the public outcry was immediate. Vigils sprang up in town squares, candles flickering in the dusk as strangers held hands and wept. Protesters gathered outside. Courthouses, their signs screaming demands, justice for the stolen. Who else was involved? But not all the reactions were unified. In the neighborhoods where politicians like Richard Hale and Reverend Carter had once been revered, denial ran deep. "This is a witch hunt," one parishioner spat to a news crew outside Carter's church. "They're targeting good men to cover up the real criminals." Conspiracy theories festered online, claiming the children were actors, the whole case a hoax. Mercer had seen the screenshots, anonymous accounts insisting the survivors were paid liars. It made her want to scream. The ones still missing. Then came the parents. Mercer had avoided them at first, knowing she had no answers to give. But they found her anyway, waiting outside the precinct, crowding press conferences, their faces gaunt with grief and fury. "My daughter was taken 2 years ago," one mother sobbed, thrusting a worn photo into Mercer's hands. "Is she in your files? Have you seen her?" Another father, his voice raw, demanded, "Why are you focusing on the ones you found when mine is still out there?" Mercer had no response that would satisfy them, because the truth was, the network was still operating. They had only scratched the surface. The chilling warning, it was Noah who said it. 3 days after his first interview, he asked to speak to Mercer again. This time there was no hesitation in his voice, only fear. "They're going to come for us," he said, his eyes locked onto hers. "We weren't supposed to get out," Mercer frowned. "Noah, you're safe here. No one knows where. You don't. Understand?" His hands clenched into fists. "They have people everywhere. Cops, doctors, they'll find us." Before she could press further, a caseworker hurried in, her face pale. "Detective, you need to see this." On her phone was a live news feed. The safe house's location, this safe house, had just been broadcast on a fringe conspiracy site. And outside the gates, a crowd was gathering. Some carried candles, others wore masks. Justice, exposure, and the fight. Ahead, the courtroom was packed. Reporters jostled for space in the back rows, their cameras trained on the defendants, men and women who had once moved. Through society with impunity, their crimes hidden behind titles and tailored suits. Now they sat in shackles, their faces drawn, their eyes darting between the judge and the survivors, seated just feet away. Detective Sarah Mercer watched from the prosecution's side, her fingers tight around her pen. After months of dead ends, betrayals and sleepless nights, this was supposed to feel like victory. It didn't. The first plea deal councilman Richard Hale was the first to break. Faced with irrefutable evidence, the burner phone, the financial trails, the testimony of a terrified aide who had kept meticulous records, he took a deal, 25 years in exchange for names. "There's a list," he muttered to prosecutors, his voice barely audible over the hum of the courtroom. "People you haven't even looked at yet." The names he gave sent shockwaves through the FBI's field offices. A state senator, a retired police chief, 2 pediatricians who had falsified medical records to make abused children disappear into the system. Thus, each arrest made headlines, each headline sparked protests, and each protest forced the question, how was this allowed to happen? The survivors faced their abusers, then came the trials without deals. Reverend Elias Carter refused to admit guilt, his lawyer spinning grand conspiracies about government overreach and religious persecution. But his defiance crumbled when Lila took the stand. The little girl, now clutching the same stuffed bear from her first interview, pointed at him with a trembling finger. "He told me God sent him to take me," she whispered, "but God wouldn't do that." Carter's face went gray. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. Life without parole. The legislation fight outside the courtroom. Change was brewing. Senator Evelyn Cho, her voice shaking with fury on the Senate floor, introduced the Shield Act, a sweeping bill that would mandate harsher sentences for traffickers, expand funding for victim rehabilitation, and create a federal task force dedicated solely to dismantling dark web marketplaces. "This isn't just about punishment," Cho declared. "It's about prevention. Because every child we failed was a policy we didn't pass, a loophole we didn't close, a warning, sign we ignored. Opponents called it government overreach, advocates called it the bare minimum, and in the middle were the survivors, watching as politicians debated their worth in dollar amounts and vote counts. The national reckoning. The case had become a cultural flashpoint. Late-night hosts cracked grim jokes about monsters in pews. Hashtags like Tomush Not One More Child trended for weeks. Even celebrities joined the fray, donating millions to survivor funds and using red carpets to demand action. But beneath the performative outrage, Mercer saw the cracks. Some news outlets downplayed the scope framing it as an isolated incident. Conspiracy theorists insisted the survivors were crisis actors. And in quiet corners of the internet, the dark web marketplaces were already regrouping, their users migrating to new, more encrypted platforms. The machine hadn't been dismantled. It had just been inconvenienced. The unanswered questions, the most damning revelations came from the traffickers who turned on each other. Vincent Crow's name surfaced again and again, a shadowy financier who had allegedly bankrolled the entire operation from offshore accounts. But Crow remained elusive, his lawyers successfully delaying extradition from whatever unnamed country he'd fled to. Then there were the children still missing. Despite Hale's cooperation, despite raids on suspected holding sites, over 60 names remained on the unaccounted-for list. Parents held on to grainy surveillance footage and old birthday photos, begging for answers no one could give. "We found 109, Mercer told one weeping father. "That means we can find more." She wasn't sure she believed it. The cost of silence. In the end, the numbers were staggering. Children rescued. Duyad. Children. 47 arrests, 12 plea deals, 8 life sentences. But the real toll couldn't be quantified. It was in the way Noah still slept with the lights on, the way Marisol refused to be touched, even by doctors, the way Lila's bear had to be pried from her hands every night for washing because she couldn't bear to let it go. It was in the parents who still waited and in the ones who never would. The closing line as the last trial adjourned, Mercer stepped outside into the blinding sunlight. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions she couldn't answer. Behind her, the courthouse doors swung shut with a heavy thud, a symbolic end to a case that had consumed her life. But as she walked away, one thought echoed louder than the chaos. Operation Soteria. Shield didn't just rescue 109 children. It pulled back the curtain on America's darkest secret and reminded us what silence costs.
The story is to be continued. What did you think of the case? Please share your thoughts in the comment below. If you want more video like this, please be sure to like the video, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on more true crime videos. See you in the next one.